The gavel slammed down. "You're nothing but a statistic." The judge sneered at the trembling 17-year-old girl in an orange jumpsuit. "You'll be back in my courtroom if you survive the streets." 12 years later, that same girl stepped into the courthouse, not in cuffs but in a prosecutor's suit. And today, she wasn't here for justice, she was here for him. The courtroom smelled the same: old wood, stale coffee, and the weight of shattered lives. But this time, Amira Blake wasn't the terrified teenager standing before a sneering judge. She was the one holding the power. Judge Richard Holloway, the same man who once mocked her, entered with his usual arrogance. He had sentenced thousands, crushed futures with a flick of his wrist. To him, justice wasn't blind. It was a weapon, wielded against those he deemed unworthy. As he settled in, the prosecution team stood. "Your Honor, the state is ready," Amira's voice rang through the courtroom. Holloway barely glanced up until he did. And then, for a split second, his face faltered. Recognition, a shadow of unease. He quickly masked it. "Counselor Blake, first time in my courtroom?" Amira smiled. "Oh no, Your Honor, I've been here before." The words hung heavy in the air. Holloway's fingers twitched against the gavel. He forced a smirk. "Well then, let's see if you've learned how justice really works." Amira tilted her head. "Oh, I have. Today wasn't just another case. It was a chess game." And Holloway had no idea that he was already in check. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, forcing a smug grin as the trial began. He was untouchable. He had spent decades bending the law to his will, protecting his kind, and burying cases that threatened his position. But something about Amira unsettled him. She was too calm, too controlled, too familiar. As the prosecution laid out its case, Amira's presence dominated the room. Her sharp questioning left the defense scrambling. Every statement, every objection, precise, calculated. And then she struck. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional evidence." Holloway sighed. "Is it relevant, Counselor Blake?" Amira stepped forward, locking eyes with him. "I'd say it's crucial, especially considering it involves your history of judicial misconduct." Silence. Holloway's grip on the gavel tightened. "Excuse me." She didn't blink. "A pattern of bias in your courtroom, dozens of cases, wrongful sentences, missing transcripts, mysteriously altered rulings, and one, in particular, from 12 years ago, involving a black minor you ridiculed before sending her to juvie." A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. The jury shifted uncomfortably. The defense lawyer glanced at Holloway, suddenly uneasy. The judge forced a dry chuckle. "I don't entertain baseless accusations." Amira folded her arms. "Neither does the State Bar Association." She slid a thick file across the table. "This is just the beginning." For the first time in his career, Judge Holloway felt something unfamiliar: fear. And Amira, she was just getting started. Judge Holloway's smirk didn't return. His fingers tapped the bench. A nervous tic he didn't realize had resurfaced. The courtroom had never felt this small before. "Counselor Blake," he said, his voice measured, "this is highly inappropriate. If you have grievances, take them up with the bar, not my courtroom." Amira leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Oh, I have. But today this is your courtroom, and the jury deserves to know exactly who's presiding over their case." A bead of sweat formed at the Holloway's temple. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a crisp gray suit, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to—" Overruled. Holloway cut him off. He needed control. He needed to shut this down. "This trial will continue without any more of these distractions." He lifted his gavel. only for Amira to speak again. "Your Honor, I wonder if you remember case number 04726? The People versus Amira Blake." The courtroom froze. The air turned electric. Holloway's lips parted, but no words came out. She said it. The jury looked from Holloway to Amira, their curiosity now piqued. Amira picked up a file, flipping through the pages like she was reading a bedtime story. A 17-year-old girl, first-time offender, sentenced to 18 months in juvenile detention for an infraction that usually results in community service. Not just sentenced, mocked by the judge, who told her she would never be anything more than a statistic. Holloway's throat went dry. "That judge was you?" A sharp inhale from the jury box. The prosecutor, the very person fighting for justice, had once been his victim. Holloway's fingers twitched. "This can't be happening." Amira's voice was calm, steady, but underneath it lay a blade sharpened over 12 years. "Your Honor, considering your history of bias, perhaps you should recuse yourself from this trial." Holloway's jaw clenched. He had spent decades controlling this system. He wasn't about to be brought down by a girl he thought he'd buried. His gavel slammed down. Motion denied. But this wasn't over. Amira just tilted her head. She had expected that, and she was ready for his next move. Holloway's denial was expected, but it was also his first mistake. He still believed he held the power. Amira didn't flinch. She simply smiled, the kind of smile that said, "I've already won." She turned to the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'd like to introduce Exhibit B." A large screen flickered to life. The room stilled as an old courtroom video began playing. Grainy footage. A teenage girl in an orange jumpsuit, trembling at the defendant's table. And then, his voice. "You're nothing but a statistic." The jury visibly tensed. Some gasped. Others looked at Holloway with disgust. Amira let the moment sink in before she spoke. "This is a direct quote from Judge Holloway, spoken to a minor who had no criminal record." She turned, locking eyes with him. "Me?" The oxygen in the room vanished. Holloway gripped his gavel so hard his knuckles turned white. "This is a smear campaign. That video was taken out of context." Amira tilted her head. "Oh? Let's hear more context then." The video continued. More of his cruel words, his dismissive tone, his mockery. The jury's eyes darkened. The court reporter, who had spent years working under Holloway, lowered her gaze, shame flickering across her face. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Holloway's carefully built empire was crumbling. Then Amira played her final card. She placed a thick manila folder on the table. "And this is a signed affidavit from a former court clerk stating that you have tampered with legal records to hide your judicial misconduct." Holloway's face drained of color. Amira wasn't just here to humiliate him. She was here to end him. "Your Honor, if you refuse to recuse yourself, I will be filing an immediate motion with the Ethics Committee, along with every single piece of evidence you see here today." Holloway hesitated. The silence stretched, suffocating. And then, for the first time in his career, he felt powerless. Amira wasn't the scared girl he sentenced all those years ago. She was his reckoning, and the whole world was watching. The courtroom was dead silent. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. Judge Holloway's face twitched, panic creeping in. He had spent decades ruling with an iron fist, making people disappear with a stroke of his pen. But now, he was the one trapped in a cage. He swallowed hard, gripping his gavel. Control, regain control. "Enough of this nonsense," he snapped. "This trial will proceed as scheduled. The prosecution is advised to focus on the case at hand." Amira cut him off. "This is the case at hand, Your Honor." Her voice was ice-cold, unshakable. She stepped forward, placing another document on the table. "Your misconduct goes beyond my case. I have records of over a dozen wrongful convictions, all tied to your courtroom." Gasps rippled through the jury. Holloway's mask cracked. "You think you can destroy me?" His voice was lower now, almost a whisper. Amira's gaze didn't waver. "I think you already destroyed yourself." The judge glanced around, at the jury, at the audience, at the court reporters. His power was slipping. His lawyer, a stiff-faced man in a navy suit, leaned in. "We need to shut this down. Declare a mistrial." Holloway shook his head. A mistrial meant an investigation, and an investigation meant exposure. His voice wavered slightly as he turned back to Amira. "This is a blatant attack on my career. You have no right—" The doors burst open. A group of men in suits stepped inside. The State Bar Ethics Committee. Holloway's face turned gray. One of them stepped forward, holding up a legal notice. "Judge Richard Holloway, you are hereby suspended from the bench, effective immediately, pending an investigation into judicial misconduct." Holloway stood frozen. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The courtroom erupted. Reporters bolted for their phones. The jury exchanged stunned looks. Even the bailiff, who had once enforced Holloway's every order, took a slow step away from him. The judge looked at Amira. And for the first time in his life, he was the one being sentenced. Amira exhaled slowly, her job almost done. Almost. Because this wasn't the final blow. That was coming next. Judge Holloway sat paralyzed, his world collapsing around him. The gavel, his symbol of power, now felt like a dead weight in his trembling hand. Suspended, investigated, exposed. But Amira, she wasn't done. She walked toward the bench, slow and deliberate, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Your Honor, oh wait, I suppose I should say, Mr. Holloway now." The humiliation hit him like a slap. She turned to the Ethics Committee. "I have one last piece of evidence to submit, a USB drive." The lead investigator took it, inserting it into a laptop. A video popped up on the screen, and Amira nodded. "Play it." The screen flickered. Security footage. A back room. A man in a judge's robe. Holloway. Across from him, a defense attorney, one of his favorites. Their voices echoed through the courtroom. "You get your client to plead guilty. I'll make sure he gets the lightest sentence. And if you handle my real estate paperwork, we can forget that bribery nonsense, yeah?" The courtroom erupted. Shouts, murmurs. Reporters scrambling to capture the scandal of the decade. Holloway's face drained of all color. He had been caught. Red-handed. The Ethics Committee leader stood. "Effective immediately, Richard Holloway, you are not only removed from the bench, but you will also face criminal charges for judicial corruption and bribery." The bailiff, the same one who had once followed Holloway's every order, now approached him with handcuffs. "Please stand." For the first time in his life, Judge Holloway was the one being sentenced. His hands shook as cold steel snapped around his wrists. He turned to Amira, his final plea in his eyes. But Amira, she just smiled. "Justice, Mr. Holloway, the kind you always denied to others." And as they led him away, she knew her work here was done. Holloway was dragged through the side exit of the courtroom, his head down, his face pale. The cameras flashed, the reporters shouted. The world that once bowed to him was now watching him fall. Publicly, mercilessly. But Amira, she wasn't watching. She had already turned away. As she stepped outside, the crisp air hit her skin. Freedom, closure, Victory. Her phone buzzed. A message. Turn on the news. She did. The screen lit up with a breaking news alert. Former Judge Richard Holloway indicted on corruption charges, facing 30-plus years in prison. Amira exhaled. It was over. She looked up at the courthouse, the same building where she had been sentenced as a teenager, mocked, belittled. Now, she owned this place. A young girl, maybe 16, maybe 17, stood near the steps watching Amira with wide eyes, nervous, curious, hopeful. Amira smiled and walked toward her. First time in court? The girl hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'm here for a hearing. It's stupid, I shouldn't even be here. Amira recognized the fear in her eyes. She knew that feeling too well. She handed the girl her card. Call me when it's over. The girl frowned. Why? Amira smirked. Because no one's going to ruin your future on my watch. The girl took the card, gripping it tightly. And for the first time that day, she looked a little less scared. Amira turned, walking down the courthouse steps, her heels clicking with purpose. She didn't need revenge anymore. She had something better. Justice.